Teri is a champion of Pachakacha. You've done this before. Just one time. She's a journalist, currently is a public affairs director of the North Carolina Railroad Company. She writes as an independent journalist for a variety of publications and organizations. For 3 years, she's been documenting the modern civil rights movement here, locally in Raleigh. The title of her presentation is Beyond Moral Monday. Teri, take it away.
All right, the ground on the Halifax Square in downtown Raleigh used to be completely covered over with a soft, green, well-manicured lawn. But now, the long, wild courtyard is mostly brown dirt, and it's mud when it rains, after thousands of people wore away the grass over 13 weeks of citizen protest, known far and wide as Moral Monday. The protesters, in smaller numbers at first, originally gathered on the sidewalks in front of the main legislative building until the crowds grew too big, and they had to start taking up residence on the mall, located between the State Education Building and the Legislative Office Building. A pedestrian bridge connects this complex to the back door of the main legislative building, dubbed the People's House by the Reverend William Barber II, president of the North Carolina chapter of the NAACP. The movement has been around for a long time, but in Raleigh, it wasn't until 2010 when the NAACP began marching on the Wake County Board of Education that the movement began to capture the public's imagination. The protests focused on what Barber referred to as the regressive efforts to resegregate the county school system. It started with a few protesters and grew to thousands. Arrests soon followed. Local leaders found themselves in a cell, too, where they penned a modern version of Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail and called it their letter from the Wake County jail. During the 3 years since the Wake County School Board protests, which attracted national attention and caused an upheaval in the election polls, Barber and the state NAACP have held Monday night marches to give voices to those who have no voice and to shore up support for voting rights, women's rights, fair wages, equal education opportunities in the 2014 elections. Well, going to Moral Monday, if you've been, you know that it feels a little bit like going to church. There's preaching and singing and praying and chanting, liturgical style. Voice, forward together, congregation, not one step back. There's an altar call that leads the true believers not to the pulpit, but straight to a prison bus and into the county jail, where they sacrifice their freedom for a few hours and put their reputations on the line in support of the cause. This is what democracy looks like, Barber's big commanding voice echoes over his passionate flock as they turn and wave angry fists towards the People's House, shouting, "That is what hypocrisy looks like." And they hope elected officials will hear them. Barber is a preacher by profession and uses his oratory skills with a generous dose of the Holy Ghost thrown in to great effect in the protest movement. Back in August, I boarded a bus and made the journey to our nation's capital to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the historic March on Washington. As you recall, you may not recall, but you either recall or you've read about it. In 1963, nearly 250,000 people traveled to Washington on trains, buses, and by hitching rides. Many people risked their lives, but they were rewarded when they got there and they heard the Reverend King recite his dreams of a better future for his children and his grandchildren. And on the 50th anniversary, those children and grandchildren, now all grown up, marched for their own dreams. They marched for educational equality, racial equality, for their right to vote. They marched for peace and for economic equality. They marched to support human rights. They marched for Reverend King's dream, and they marched for love. They marched for the community, and they marched for Trayvon Martin. They came alone, and they came in groups. They brought their own children, and together they marched for change, for a piece of the American dream, for justice and civil rights, for jobs, for freedom of speech. They marched in solidarity, and they marched to claim their own spot in history. Some who had marched that half-century ago returned last August and brought their children so they could relive the experience together. And when they got there, they marched again to keep the dream alive. and they marched because they represent Reverend King's dreams themselves. And during the hot summer of 2013, North Carolinians united to support their dreams too. Every Monday before the protest, Barber has conducted a seminar on civil disobedience, including instructions for being arrested. He also instructs his congregation, who obediently split into 2 sections to create a pathway for those heading to jail. They make their way into the people's house, where they sing and pray until state government officers and the local police bind their wrists with plastic zip ties and lead them to the waiting buses. As they walk the gauntlet, wearing strips of green fabric tied around their upper arms to signify their intentions to practice civil disobedience, supporters reach out to touch them, hug them, shake their hands, and thank them for their sacrifice and service to the cause. The mall empties out as the protesters left behind rally in front of the prison buses in support of their arrested comrades as they are carried a few blocks to jail. Other protesters who have already served their time wear buttons that say, "I went to jail with Reverend Barber," and they carry signs reading, "Jailbird for Justice." Men show up wearing pink to support women's health. A little boy clad only in a disposable diaper, sucking on a bottle of milk and looking for all the world like the New Year's baby, toddles around wearing an equality sticker on his bottom. There are women and men holding signs that shout, "They are pissed off." Even dogs wear signs saying they are pissed off too. The protests take on a carnival quality. The NAACP calls for donations, and people hold up bills and drop them into large red plastic bins. A group of protesters stage a sit-in on the lawn with their legs crossed and their eyes closed. They hold signs in their laps that bear sayings like, "Never forget that justice is what love looks like in public, and there is power in me." Giant puppets occasionally dance on the lawn. People arrive dressed in costumes. At one rally, even Uncle Sam practiced civil disobedience, and he went to jail too. They are old, young, and middle-aged, gay and straight, rabbi, priest, pastor, minister. They are Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist, Jewish, Muslim, and Catholic. They are doctors, lawyers, teachers, artists, engineers, and students. Real passion and even rapture shine on the faces of the believers as they soak up the Spirit, both historic and holy. And the scene makes a little bit of magic, too. If the light is just right, and if you squint your eyes in a certain way, hold your head just right, and use just enough imagination, you can sort of make out the ghostly shapes of those who came before. They are moving among us, after all. Hand in hand, arm in arm, they are still marching up to Freedom Land.